I have a starting question for Cynthia.
Go ahead, yes.
We've started to talk about the NEV policy that China is coming up with. And I know you haven't analyzed that, but what happens when you overlay that on the two other fuel efficiency standards? What do you end up with?
So thanks, Marianne, for the great question. So we have not, the particular paper we talked about does not have that particular mandate. When you, for mandates in general, mandates are unfortunately an inefficient policy instrument. So for example, in the US federal level, we've had mandates relating to ethanol. So, and unfortunately with mandates, while well-intentioned, they actually don't do as well as other types of policies. And the intuition is that mandate implicitly subsidizes whatever is being mandated, even though they might not be the perfect technology for the problem at hand. And so electric vehicles are, have many benefits, and that both Marianne and Timothy have outlined. However, there are some drawbacks for electric vehicles if what we care about, for example, are emissions or maybe global climate change concerns and things like that. Certainly if we care about congestion, electric vehicles, as Marianne pointed out, actually might lead to more driving, and so that actually might not address congestion. But even for things like emissions, and this is not entirely obvious, but when we're charging the vehicle on the electric grid, the emissions come from whatever power plant is being used to produce that electricity at that hour in that location where that vehicle is being charged. And sometimes in some areas when you're charging your vehicle, it might be a coal plant, it might be some polluting plant that is actually emitting. And so even though we don't see any emissions that much coming from the electric vehicle being driven itself, electric vehicles themselves might actually cause emissions. And so electric vehicles aren't the perfect technology. They're a good technology for many reasons. And so mandates may be imperfect if what we're trying to address is, for example, trying to address emissions concerns. And so, and certainly when we overlay policies on top of each other, all of which are imperfect, it doesn't necessarily mean that what we get is a better outcome. So thanks for that.
And actually, a quick question about the fuel economy standard, which is a single number type thing as opposed to a weighted average. So how do electric cars score in that? Very highly, easily? I mean, are they exempt from it? How are they handled?
So in the Chinese context with, so for the fuel, so there were two policies that we looked at. So the fuel economy standard actually just applies to all cars, and it's a particular fuel economy standard. The corporate average fuel consumption standard has particular sort of weights associated with different types of vehicles, and then firms are asked to average across a sales weighted average of all the vehicles they produce with a target associated with each type of vehicle. And their electric vehicles are weighted more heavily, meaning that if you have an electric vehicle, it sort of benefits your average, so that's more likely for you to meet that standard. This relates to one issue when we're thinking about things such as US CAFE standards or corporate average fuel economy standards, where there might be a different target level for different types of vehicles. Oftentimes, for example, in the US context and other contexts, there's a different attribute upon which we divide different cars that have different targets associated with it, and this might be the weight of the car or the size of the car. And various studies have found that when we have these attribute-based regulations, this may be inefficient and cause automobile companies to distort their decisions of other attributes, including such as weight and size. And so things that might sound so great, like putting additional or changing the target for various types of vehicles, such as electric vehicles or large vehicles or vehicles of certain weight or that sort of thing, that may sound like there's reasons to do that, actually potentially has unintended consequences as well.
Actually, the United States is the only region that looks at CO2 emissions honestly, in my opinion. They take into account the grid. Not initially, because there's a desired incentive to give battery electric vehicles or other electrified vehicles an advantage to stimulate that market. But after a certain volume is hit, a cumulative volume, a couple 100,000 vehicles, cumulative volume, well then the grid is taken into account in the tailpipe. And that doesn't happen anyplace else in the world. So that is one unique feature of the U.S. Regulation.
And one reaction to what you said about the corporate fuel efficiency standard, that if you add a lot of electric vehicles, then you can produce a lot of ICE SUVs too, right? And that's what we'd expect to find, and that's what we're starting to hear.
There's that lever chart.
That's right. That's right. On the, this kind of maybe more a question for you, Tim. We hear a lot, as you pointed out, and others will, about this cost parity for electric vehicles that may be coming, fairly soon, according to some estimates. And we do know that it's easy to make an electric vehicle hot, performing. That just comes with the territory in terms of the technology. On the other hand, there's cost parity, but for market acceptance, one has to consider convenience and capability parity. And most practical measures of convenience aren't, like a Tesla moving from a 4-second 0 to 60 time to a 3.5 second or whatever it is. It's, the kind of factors that are driving people into larger vehicles everywhere. So I'm wondering how you think of cost parity in the context of what we might call value parity, where you consider convenience and many other measures of capability that customers are interested in motor vehicles.
Yeah, that's the big question. Really, I tried to highlight that with my question on market acceptability. Regarding the Tesla, the market studies that I've seen indicate that the battery electric vehicle feature of the Tesla is number 2 or number 3 on the purchase decision. People are buying, this is the Tesla S and the X, I guess, the upper range vehicles that people are more enthralled by the performance and by the novelty, I guess, for lack of a better term, of that Tesla vehicle. And only on a second or third level does the environmental impact come into play. So that I think is very interesting. But yeah, you're correct, John. It is how we perceive this whole thing. And for example, we all say, well, I'll make a 300-mile trip in a day, maybe 4 times a year. I don't want an electric vehicle. It won't do that. I'm going to reach 250 miles and get range anxiety. I'm only going to use it for my second vehicle. Well, the Chevy Bolt, there was a journal paper that GM gave on looking at rental car costs and putting that into the decision on the capacity of the battery that goes into the Bolt. So they were contemplating the market buying a Chevy Bolt, but then renting a car for long distance driving, and use that in part of their decision on the size of the battery that went into the Bolt. So, all these things are very dynamic right now on how the market will perceive it. And we just saw an announcement a few months ago that Renault and BMW and I think Nissan are offering replacement batteries for their electric vehicles for, I don't know, $5,000. So, a relative discount to what they might buy in a parts dealer or whatever, to get up to alleviate that anxiety on battery range and depreciation.
Could I just add something on consumer acceptance? People seem to leave out the fact that if we really are getting EV penetration, gasoline demand will decline, and therefore the gasoline price will drop. Mm-hmm. So it becomes even harder to reach parity when you have a declining gasoline price. And
actually, I'll make this the last question up here because I see people are starting to line up. But this one's for you, Marianne. With respect to the outlook for oil demand, and then as was mentioned, as, say, expectations rise regarding foregone demand or demand destruction from efficiency changes, electrification, and so on, that creates a risk in terms of adequate upstream investment. How does that relate to the changing structure of oil and gas itself, in the sense that its technology disruption, which has seen a real technology disruption over the past decade plus, changes the cost recovery parameters and the life cycle expected. If you're trying to, like Shell's multiple attempts to put a huge, platform in the Arctic, for that to work, it would, be probably a 40-year proposition. So how is how are these factors in terms of investment economics, interacting here, and how have they changed structurally?
Well, I think just with the recent price decline we've had, you have found that offshore projects, oil sands projects, the economics are challenged. Now you add the uncertainty about demand in the future, and you see companies, to the extent they have their portfolio availability to do this, they are moving away from long-term projects to shorter-term projects, particularly if they have a U.S. tight oil or shale gas position. So you actually see an avoidance of larger projects. Now, I would say that it's not as dramatic as it initially was, because what you're finding is these long-term projects are finding a way to have segments, so a piece comes on sooner, so you don't have to wait 10 years for a new offshore project to get production. You can get production in 3 years, and you build it up as a modular project. Also, cost deflation is still very big in the offshore, whereas the onshore tight oil costs, you're starting to see cost inflation coming back with the activity levels. So, I mean, the difference isn't as dramatic as it was, say, maybe a year ago, but I think companies are going to think twice before they invest in these large 20-year projects, and are going to invest in short-term, quick payback projects, but also lower cost projects, which means you want to do U.S. tight oil, you want OPEC production, you don't want necessarily the offshore production or the oil sands production, unless the offshore is such a large find that it's economic at a low price and it's close to infrastructure.
Okay, great. Well, I think let's now turn to questions from the audience. And I think Xiao Hong, if I'm pronouncing your name more or less correctly, is up first.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. My name is Zheng Hongling, Oak Ridge National Lab. I have two questions, but I'm going to just ask one and then wait to see if I have more time. So, so this question is for all three speakers, and that is related to the observation that Tim said the IC investments will become more difficult as batteries improve, and that to me is a very important, because on one hand we are seeing the electric vehicle market share is very small right now. Okay, and even in the 2030, 2040, then most of the projections they're not exceeding half of the market, right? And now you're saying it is affecting the investment, and also, I heard from multiple professors who are saying that it's becoming more difficult to recruit students who are interested in doing engine research. They all want to do EV-related research, right? So I just kind of interested and also confused about how come it could be so early in terms of either the human capital or financial investment. So I just hope that you can elaborate more with potentially more observations on this point. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let me give you an anecdote that happened within my company, something that I might be able to speak a little bit more expertly about. We have a great new opportunity within my division to put gasoline particulate filters on the exhaust of gasoline vehicles to make them virtually negative emission vehicles in terms of fine particulate. And it was mandated essentially by regulations in China and Europe, very big markets, nearly 100% of the vehicles within certain classes need this. It was almost a sure thing. And we went to the board of directors to get money to build a plant, and they rejected it. They said, you got to come back to us and prove to us that we're going to be able to recover our capital in light of the battery electric vehicle information that we're hearing. And we were able to do that. We went back and did some studies and came back and showed the levels of battery electric vehicle penetration that would have to be made to jeopardize our investment, and they turned out to be beyond the forecasts. So we were able to get that investment, but the auto companies are a little bit different. You know, their payback periods might be longer. They have to compete in a market against others. It's not mandated like our technologies. And I can't go into a lot of detail, but I've talked with powertrain executives from major companies, and they said it's getting very, very difficult today to get capital to retool an engine plant, that they have to do much more now than they did in the past to get this money. So it's having implication in investment, R&D. We had to change our hiring policies to get people to work on emissions. You know, something that is a good thing, and so we had to set our expectations differently.
Doug.
Doug Kelbaugh, I'm professor of architecture, urban planning, and someone who's been working with renewable energy in the built environment since 1974. So this wonderful venue begs the following comment. I look out here at all these electric golf carts scooting around. I look out this window and I see a parking lot full of huge internal combustion engine cars, probably single occupancy vehicles. I'd hate to know just how many came in their own car, but I mean, land use and infrastructure require that. That's a whole other issue. But what I'm impressed with after hearing today's talk is what's under the hood out there, all that horsepower, this American preference, which might be described as adolescent for power. And I know you car companies have to provide what the public wants, but your advertising could maybe play down the macho dimension of vehicles a little more. But more importantly, will the change to electric allow us to also get over this horsepower predilection and deal with that because of the, you know, we got great torque at low RPMs, all that sort of stuff. Can we somehow sneak that into the agenda? Because frankly, we are so overpowered. It's absurd. Our grandkids will be laughing at us. Thank you.
But they'll buy up those old cars.
Yeah. You know, thank you, Doug. I'll make a quick remark on that. You know, of course, electric vehicles are very diverse. I mean, especially in China, more than I know, where, you know, in fact, the government's trying to, you know, regulate these small, almost homemade lead-acid powered vehicles that are very popular in rural regions, all the way now to Tesla coming into China and creating a lot of excitement in the high end of the market. But what we're seeing certainly in the United States is that electric vehicles are coming into the high end with very high performance expectations. In other words, they're creating and reinforcing these traditional expectations about what a vehicle is, and sort of the next wave that likely to come in a big way are the, you know, vehicles coming from BMW and Audi, and that makes sense in some sense because you can hide some of these extra costs in a premium value proposition. So I think Doug's point is well taken, but it's going to be tricky. Go ahead.
Hello, My name is Zainab Al-Khulali, and I am the representative of the Washtenaw Economics Club. Basically, my question has to do with accommodations and modifications for electric cars in the future. I'm 17. I'm going to be purchasing my first car pretty soon. Obviously, I don't have $80,000 to blow in a Tesla, nor do I have 400 miles to drive. And I was wondering, basically, are there actions being taken to accommodate the growth of electric vehicles, and how much will it cost? Because I was wondering whether you would be willing to have an electric vehicle as your main car, Mr. Johnson, if there were reliable electric charging stations everywhere you went.
You're asking a personal question.
But I think her first question is a good one for you also,
in the grand
Tim.
scheme of things.
Yeah.
No, my driving behavior is very amenable to an electric vehicle. I'm actually quite interested, and I think that it can be very attractive for many people, and most of them. I have an ongoing argument with a friendly sparring match with a colleague of mine who really believes that 300-mile range is good enough for all applications. And he says if you're driving 300 miles across the country, that's about all you can take in one stretch. You want to stop and get some food. You go and charge up while you're eating and come out with a 80 or 90% charged vehicle to make the rest of your 200-mile trip on a 500-mile day. So, you know, he's convinced that the availability of a charging network will help that. Yeah, if we see cost parity on some vehicle platforms, I'm not saying all of them, but cost parity in 2025, I think that could be a real game changer for people that are buying their first car.
Tim.
My name is Terry Phillips. I'm the COO of Arbor Wind. We're a wind turbine technology company here in Ann Arbor, vertical axis. So I have a vested interest in clean energy, and we're distributed power too, so we can actually, go on site in the urban environment, at a commercial level. So my question is about infrastructure and investment. We've seen the hype before with hydrogen cars before. California, I know Honda invested a lot in infrastructure. Are you seeing a trend in auto companies or other companies, in China included, putting money in infrastructure if they're so optimistic and bullish on the future of electric vehicles?
Well, I could say that China is certainly investing in renewable infrastructure for their own reasons, to diversify away from coal.
Right.
But that will certainly help them if they can get them hooked up to the grid and have long voltage lines. In fact, you might comment more on that. But I don't see, it's who is going to make the investments in the electric grid is the issue.
Infrastructure.
And there's a different regulatory structure in every country and in every state. So it's not an obvious question who does the smart grid. Utilities, of course, would love electric vehicles because they would like to, they'd like people to charge at night and then be able to use up the spare capacity that isn't being used. I think governments will want to shift the load to when either their solar or their wind is running. So you need time of day pricing and other sort of incentive systems to get people to charge at the appropriate time, or smart meters that start charging at the right time when electric power demand is down. But there's a serious issue about how to get investment in the grid, and it's not just the smart grid. You need, I think every fast charger has the electricity use of something like 20 to 30 homes in a neighborhood. So it's the transformers, it's all that other investment. And it's not obvious who drives that investment or how you get paid for making that investment. So I don't have an answer for you, but it's a darn good question.
I'm wondering if I could invite you to make some remarks on that.
Yes,
You-
yes.
She
So,
looked at that too.
So thanks, Terry, for the great questions. I have two things to say. So first on the topic, so this is relating to points that both Marianne and Timothy have made. For better or worse, for a lot of sort of emerging industries, including renewable fuels and electric vehicles, that oftentimes government support policies may be important in driving them and enabling them to be competitive. So in other work, I had a previous outstanding PhD student who was looking at the wind industry in Denmark. And so Denmark is probably the best example of a very vibrant wind industry. And we're looking at investment decisions there in Denmark and seeing whether or not, so there's, the Danish government has support policies that support the wind industry, and wanted to see whether or not the wind industry was evolving and became so vibrant because of technological developments and decisions by wind turbine farms and wind turbine owners themselves, or was it because of government policy? And we sort of modeled their decision making. We found that the government policy was actually really important in supporting the wind industry in Denmark. And the vibrancy of that industry in Denmark was in large part due to government support policies. This relates to my second point, which is that, and this is somewhat related to a question that Zhen Hong brought up, policies are very important. They could, for better or worse, determine what types of technologies are ones that industries and consumers focus on. So we've been discussing how mandates or some other policies, or maybe the perception of penetration of electric vehicles, or maybe the perception that there will be policy supporting electric vehicles has, for better or worse, maybe shifted some decisions about investments. I think because government support policies are important, especially for emerging industries, it's also important for people who design policies to think about designing them well. Because when they, if they choose a particular technology or maybe design a policy that's just aimed at something that's not related to their underlying desire, which might be reducing emissions, for example, then it may distort decisions in ways that we might not intend. And so Timothy had outlined all these great technologies related to ICEs, and for better or worse, you know, we might be hindering some technological progress in some other dimensions if we overly favor certain technologies over others, rather than just allowing them all to compete and see which ones are the best.
I'll just add a very quick comment. Charging stations are now turning profitable. They aren't now.
You said they are not, or they are?
They are not now. But they are turning profitable. The cost of a charging kiosk is going down. The utility of that charging kiosk is going up. The demand charges, which determine the cost of the energy, is going down. So all of these trends are moving towards private investment in the charging infrastructure. Therefore, we're seeing companies like Shell and BP and others getting into it.
Well, I've seen, as a quick
I'd
follow-up.
like to, rather than going back and forth, because we're close on time, I'd like to keep the questions moving, but thanks, Terry. Zhen Hong, do you want to, or do you want, it might be good to get a student question, another student question. So yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Andres Mendez. I'm a student, a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. And I want to ask Dr. Cynthia Lynn Lawell a question. So in the context of the Chinese car market, you mentioned that some of the companies are state-owned and some of them are privately owned. And I was wondering if the regulations were, like, the government is setting the regulations, right? So I could imagine they could be using these regulations to favor the companies that are state-owned, right? And also, you mentioned that those companies that are joining forces with Japanese car companies are lowering their marginal costs for producing cars that are more efficient, right? Whereas those that join forces with American car makers are lowering the costs for making cars with more horsepower. So I was wondering, like, because if those companies in China that are owned by the government are joining more forces with Japanese companies, then these relations could be favoring. So my question is the relation somehow being used to favor state-owned companies?
So thanks, Andres, for the great question. So you're right that there are a lot of Chinese automobile companies that are state-owned, and that just as you say, there's probably multiple objectives of the government, and that's why the objectives of these state-owned firms aren't necessarily just profit maximization, and they might be things that are very much tied with things related to policy as well. And so, for example, among the objectives we allow these state-owned firms to possibly consider are things related to electric vehicles. So just as it was mentioned how the Chinese government really wants to incentivize electric vehicles and alternative vehicles, we allow these state-owned governments or state-owned companies to also potentially have some of these objectives very similar to the state-owned government. We do find that they do care about alternative vehicle protection just like the Chinese government does, and they care about other objectives that might be similar to the Chinese government, but they also care about profits as well. And a similar thing might happen in terms of joint ventures, and certainly you know, if you're the government may have, when designing its policy, may have multiple reasons to design policies, and certainly when it has ownership in some of these companies, that may affect their decision making. So some of the things relating to joint ventures are very much related to policies as well. Most recently, the Chinese government has announced that it might be modifying some of its policies relating to international joint ventures, and that may or may not be related to how its state-owned governments and their joint ventures are and what's happening with them.
Great. Well, we're right at 3 o'clock, so I'm afraid we have time for just one last question at this point. I will take it from Miho. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. My name is Miho Osawa. I am independent automotive consultant in Ann Arbor. I have just a question regarding how you guys perceive the aftermarket for the EV, because right now EV's residual value is very low, except Tesla Model S and GM Bolt. So, you know, and then a lot of people, you know, just lease EVs rather than, you know, purchasing EVs. So which means when the lease is up, those cars are going to the aftermarket. And then battery might be deteriorated. I don't know. So I'm kind of wondering what's going to happen to the aftermarket, particularly the EV penetration is going up.
I can address a little bit of that. There was an interesting study that I saw just a month ago here in Detroit at the battery show, where a company was analyzing the battery recycling, which is a big part of this. You know, the battery electric vehicle might be quite deteriorated after so many years, 5 years. And the general consensus today is that those batteries will go into the stationary market. Well, that's not what this firm was concluding. They're concluding that the metals in the battery are more valuable than the use of that battery in the stationary sector. Secondly, the stationary sector, when the battery is depleting, it depletes very quickly. It's on an accelerated degradation curve. So therefore, if you spend time to sort the batteries and reinstall them in the stationary sector, that you're going to get very limited life with it. Therefore, again, it's much more valuable to recycle that battery. So the secondary market for the battery electric vehicle might be scrapping the vehicle and recycling its parts. But as I mentioned in my earlier, a lot of the some of the auto companies now are beginning to offer replacement batteries to improve that. Yeah. But and we'll get into this later in the conference here, but with vehicle autonomy, vehicle features are improving year on year. And you know, leasing of vehicles is going to go up because everybody will want a modern featured vehicle. The electric vehicle is even much more so. You get more range, more features, more. So leasing 3 years, going into some sort of secondary market with a scrapping soon thereafter, I think, might be one way to look at this.